Coming up, Unleashing the Indigenous Imagination. We'll hear how Dr. Lee Francis does this through comics. Plus, was climate change part of the reason some hunters were left stranded in the Yukon wilderness? We'll find out. I'm Aaliyah Chavez. Join us for those interviews, plus headlines from Indian country today.
The Walter Cronkite School of Journalism and Mass Communication at Arizona State University is honored to be a supporter of Indian Country Today. ASU offers the only online undergraduate digital media literacy degree, teaching students how to recognize and combat inaccuracies on all platforms. They are using cutting-edge tools and tactics to separate fact from fiction in a digital world overloaded with misinformation. Learn more at cronkite.asu.edu.
This is Indian Country Today.
Gotwatsi Hopa. Thank you for joining us. I'm Aaliyah Chavez. Today kicks off the first day of the White House Tribal Nations Summit. The two-day virtual gathering brings together tribal leaders and senior members of the Biden-Harris administration to talk about issues affecting Indian country. President Joe Biden signed an executive order to address the epidemic of missing and murdered Indigenous people. The Departments of Justice, Interior, and Health and Human Services have been tasked with addressing law enforcement issues and to find ways to support survivors and their families. Biden also announced Monday he will block leases on new federal oil and gas projects within a 10-mile radius of the sacred site Chaco Canyon. The site was named a UNESCO World Heritage Site and is one of just 24 in the U.S. Chaco Canyon is located in northwestern New Mexico. Other federal agencies had major announcements too. The Agriculture Department announced the USDA will launch an Indigenous Food Sovereignty Initiative. It includes ways to promote traditional foods, like the construction of seed-saving centers. The projects ultimately aim to inform future USDA programs and policies.
The Indigenous Food Sovereignty Initiative's goal is to rethink how USDA does business in Indian country, from what types of food we fund, so that we start to think about empowering Indigenous foods and the growing and propagating of Indigenous foods, strengthening our Native producers and buying their products, and incorporating more Indigenous foods and Native produced foods into our food packages. What can we do as an agency to rethink and strengthen Indigenous food ways?
On Tuesday, Vice President Kamala Harris will be speaking at the summit. Secretary Holland plans to host a listening session to hear directly from tribal leaders. The gathering will take place through a live stream. Tribal leaders are able to comment and participate in the activities. Well, tribes are getting more than $73 million in grants from the Department of Housing and Urban Development to help them meet the needs exposed by the pandemic. It's the first phase of the Indian Community Development Block Grants that were funded by the American Rescue Plan. This news was announced last week. In California, U.S. Senator Alex Padilla says more than $13 million will go to 12 tribes in his state. The funds must be used for emergencies that constitute imminent threats to health and safety and respond to COVID-19 impacts. The Blue Lake Rancheria says it will purchase and rehabilitate a 5,500 square foot building that will be used as a health clinic. And the Lone Pine Paiute Shoshone tribe plans to construct a building to provide temporary shelter for families impacted by COVID-19. It is estimated other tribes across the country will be using this money in similar ways. Honoring Native warriors who served. The head of the Department of Veterans Affairs paid his respects last Thursday during Veterans Day at an event at the National Museum of the American Indian. Veterans Affairs Secretary Dennis McDonough visited the Native American Veterans Memorial, where he laid a wreath at the site and offered his, quote, heartfelt appreciation for Native vets. The memorial is new and was dedicated last year. The event was likely the first time a cabinet secretary paid tribute at the memorial since it was built. Lance Fisher, who is from the Northern Cheyenne tribe of Montana, sang a Cheyenne flag song to honor the occasion. The Native Veterans Memorial is the only of its kind on a national scale to recognize the service of Native people in all branches of the U.S. military. Well, go dust off your moccasins. Today marks the first day of Rock Your Mocks. This year's celebration is a week long, starting today and ending on November 20th. Anyone can participate by wearing moccasins to school, work, or wherever you may go. The event was first established in 2011. Since then, it has been celebrated by Indigenous people all across the world. Those who don't have moccasins or whose tribes don't traditionally wear them are encouraged to wear a turquoise-colored awareness ribbon instead. Organizers say the main day to celebrate is November 15th. Those who participate are invited to post photos of their moccasins using the hashtag #RockYourMocks. And those are the headlines for Indian Country Today. I'm Aaliyah Chavez. Coming up, adapting traditional stories for comic books, such as putting Coyote in front of a computer. What could happen? We'll be right back with Dr. Lee Francis. Mark Trahan spoke to Dr. Lee Francis recently about what's new in the world of comic books and Native stories. Turns out there's a lot of things on the horizon.
Albuquerque, New Mexico-based activist, educator, and comic creator, Dr. Lee Francis IV, is the owner and CEO of Native Realities Publishing and the founder of Indigipop X and Red Planet Books and Comics. Welcome back to the show, Lee.
Thanks so much. Let's see everybody. This is so great to be here.
Let's start. I understand you have a new anthology. Tell us about that.
Yes, just in time. I hope for the holidays, given all of the shipping woes that we are all dealing with. But we've got a great new anthology called A Howl. It's an Indigenous anthology of wolves, werewolves, and rougarou that has been created by a number of incredible Native illustrators, writers, and publishers and editors, everybody coming together to create this really fun and dynamic anthology, graphic anthology of all things werewolf.
Very exciting. I want to ask a broad question. When you think about sci-fi, one of the things that I think is underestimated is, one, it gets to the power of imagination, but two, it also ends limits. And so many of the young people in our community need that exposure to no limits.
I think that's the biggest thing. When I first founded the company, that was, I mean, it's still our mantra, to unleash the Indigenous imagination. I think historically, a lot of people don't recognize, I mean, we had our land taken, we had our language taken, but I think more insidiously was that we had our imagination taken, right? We were confined and we were contained. And so this idea of, for our young folks, for our communities, to see that they can be anything, accomplish anything, to show them heroes from their own histories and heroes from these great futures, right? That they are space rangers or superheroes or, you know, anything they can be, anything they can be and imagine. Because I think once we spark that, and I think that's the job of comics, books, and fiction and illustration and art, if we can spark that in our young people and our communities, then we're able to accomplish anything. Right? We're not bound by this historical trap, right? That Native people only exist in the past, that we already know we're a people of a future because we can see it, we can imagine it, and we can be it.
Well, in fact, even the historical trap is sometimes just misnomer, because with a 10,000-year history plus, the next 10,000 years are just going to be as interesting.
Right. And we've been here, right? That's the whole part, is that we are in the middle of the story. And I think that's so keen on the way in which, when we approach comics specifically, is that this is still just the middle of the story. And we can talk about 10,000 years into the future, and we can talk about 2 years in the future, and we can talk about 10,000 years in the past, and that our people as Native folks here have continued, and we continued. We made it through the apocalypse, our first apocalypse, and we're going to be around for a long, long time.
I want to ask you about another project you're working on that's a little different, and that's Native New York.
Oh yeah, so we had the sneak peek. It actually opens today at the National Museum of American Indian in New York City, down at the Alexander Hamilton something center, right down there in the financial district. Can't remember the end of it. It used to be the old, trade and building. Had the chance this weekend to go see it. Worked with the NMAI team and a number of incredible New York Native Indigenous consultants to bring in some comic book and some comic book illustrations. So we'll show you Alvitre, Aragon Starr, Michael Shiasi, Dale DeForest, Maria Lopez all contributed, and we all have little sections in the exhibit that help tell the stories of what they're doing with the Native New York in a graphic medium, in a sequential graphic medium.
I want to ask you a bit about the craft of comic books. One of the challenges is to being able to tell a story with really few words and powerful images, and that really takes a lot of work. It's not just something you sit down and do very easily, is it? I guess unless you're a Mozart.
You build up a practice. I think it's like any type of writing or art. There's a collaboration. There's artists who create and craft their own stories, and they can just start drawing. I'm a writer. I kind of doodle, sketch, and then pass that on to the artists that I work with. When you have a really good creative exchange between artist and writer, and especially when you're working with Native folks, you don't have to go back and explain everything, right? You just kind of get it. Then I think it creates something really dynamic, and you just build from there. You get the sense. You start automatically thinking in panels and pages, and you know how much words you can put on that page, and you know how much your spacing needs to be. And if you want, you could write a letter, and then you could fill that with words, right? And then just be an illustrated letter or something. But I think it's the intersection between both, and it's that way of storytelling, I think, that we've always kind of done, right, as Native folks, of being able to contain a lot of information in a very short space, ideally, right? Some of the stories we tell, it's contains so much information, but it's just a simple story from point A to point B that evokes so much culture, history, language, everything in between.
Well, and so much of it's character driven that we really get an affinity for these characters and feel like we know them.
Absolutely. We bring these are our heroes, right? These are the heroes that we know, and we create an affinity towards them, be it, from the mainstream, be it Spider-Man to Super Indian. There's like a deep connection that we make because we like rooting for these heroes, and it's even better when these heroes kind of look like us, right? So when we're making comics and it's a hero that, I like Spider-Man. I also like being able to see myself and my family and my community in a comic book. And I think there's an even deeper connection that comes from a lot of the stuff that we're making, whether it's Native New York or Howl or anything else we got coming up.
In some of these stories, how much of it's relied on our own stories that we've told and added a new dimension for this time?
I think it varies, but I see that a lot, and I've always loved that. I love these story adaptations. I do that a great deal. I very much love to see, how do we take traditional stories, the ones we can tell. Obviously, we want to maintain the sensitivity to our own communities and the way the stories are brought into the world. But I think also taking some of those and adapting them. You see that in the art that Roy Boney does. You see that in the work that Dale DeForest is doing. You've seen that in things like Moonshot, where a lot of the Native artists came together and sort of future cast and developed and adapted some of these traditional stories in new ways. And I think it's super important, again, so that we're not locking ourselves in a historical space. We know that our traditional stories are traditional, they're sacred, they're important, but I can use some of them characters. I could take, there's heroes for every age. So I can bring some heroes into this new age because there's still monsters about that we need to fight. I can bring tricksters into this new age because there's still lessons that we need to learn. So I always loved kind of doing that because I was like, man, what if you put Coyote in front of a computer? What would happen next? That's a hilarious kind of thing for me. I was just like, oh, it's going to wreak havoc on the internet. that's a great thing to think through, because that's how our stories develop. They're teaching you how to behave. So I think that's always fun for me.
One story that I want to ask you about is the business side of running a publishing house. It used to be there were gatekeepers and you had to try to get through a very small number of people. Now you really can start a company and reach people directly. How has that changed the landscape for storytelling?
I truly believe there's room for all stories. And when there's no gatekeepers, I mean, I think there's still a little bit of gatekeeping that goes on, but it's so much more, there's so much more ability for Native stories and Native storytellers and artists and whatever to just get right out there. Because I think a lot of folks look at it like a zero-sum game. It's like, well, if this Native story comes in, then it means I lose my story and everybody loses. And I was like, man, there's enough room for stories. We've been telling them for thousands of years, Native, non-Native, whatever. So this just gives a chance for more stories to come into the world. And so I think honestly, if this was 30 years ago, it'd be very hard for me to do what I do. I'd probably be working in the industry if I was publishing. But now I get to start, not only my own publishing house, but a distribution center for it, a comic shop that goes with it, and a convention that can spotlight all the cool things that we're doing. I was very intentional and strategic of saying, I want to break down all of these lines so that there are less gatekeepers, so that we can move from creative to, community as easy and as simple as possible.
I do want to ask you about the convention, because that's a place where people really can be themselves and celebrate this genre.
Yeah, 2022, we are in the first talks. I'm very excited. I can't announce anything because we don't really have a whole lot, but we're having I feel much more comfortable than I have for the past, 18, 19, 20 months at this point, of starting to put a timeline on this. Because I know a lot of folks have asked, and it's, and I miss everybody as well. And people are like, is it coming? And I was like, we're almost there, everybody. We're going to get really close, and I think we can finally start navigating these new waters and bring a really great event back, so that we can all get to hang out. It's kind of why I founded it in the first place. People always ask the origin. It was like, why'd you start it? And I was like, so Native folks would have a great place, and so I could hang out with all the cool people. It's always so much fun to be hanging out with Native folks and nerding out all weekend. So I'm very excited. So we're looking at fall 2022. That's our date. So just, hang tight, check our social medias, and we'll be putting out announcements hopefully really soon.
Last question, we're running out of time. What do you think about young people when they read comics? What's the lesson you hear from them?
I think that they're able to see themselves. It's about, creating heroes on their own terms. So many kids are into manga. Native kids especially are into manga these days, which is amazing, because there's a whole art form that goes with it. There's a whole different style that goes with it that I think just appeals to their souls. I'm an Indigenous nerd. I love comics because they told me stories, they taught me lessons, and they were things that were tangible and that I could hold on to through my life. I think that holds the same for all the Native kiddos out there and anybody that reads the stories that, we're making these days.
Our thanks to Dr. Lee Francis for his time. Up next, even when you're prepared for cold weather, it's never good to find yourself stranded. We'll hear from some hunters who were finally rescued after 12 days. In western Alaska, 7 men were stranded while taking a 120-mile hunting trip down the Yukon River. National correspondent Jocelyn Estes reported on the story, and she joins us now. Welcome, Jocelyn.
Hi, good to be here. So, 7 hunters, 2 sets of brothers, and one of them had his teenage son with him, and 2 friends took off from Pilot Station, which is a village of about 600 people on the Yukon River, and they were headed to the coast of the Bering Sea to go hunting. So the plan was to spend 1 day traveling downriver, another day hunting, and then a 3rd day traveling back. And everything went fine until the morning of the 2nd night camping out. And they got up and found that their 2 skiffs had frozen into the were frozen into the river. And they actually had to use axes to chop up the ice to get the boats free. So they did that, and they got the boats back out into the main channel of the river and were headed upriver. It was very slow going, but it finally got to the point where the chunks of ice that were crashing into the boats were so big that they were afraid that the boats were going to get damaged or smashed up or that tipped over. And so they made the wise decision to haul out and to wait and get help. So they had a satellite phone, and they used that to call the nearby village of Imanik. And the people there said, "You're near a cabin and that you can use." And what Alaskans do a lot of times is they leave their cabins all set up in case somebody has an emergency. So there's fresh water and some food and firewood. So as soon as you get there, you can, get warm and get some water and eat. And that's how the owner of this cabin had left her cabin. So one of the hunters, Rex Nick, says they were able to reach the owner, Lily Afghan.
I know the owner's daughter was there on the VHF radio, telling us, what they had in camp, where things were, what's good to use, things like that. They were really generous. They were helping us out. We told them we didn't want to use too much of their stuff or things like that. And they said, "Oh, that's why we left them there, in case something like this happens."
So they had enough food for several days, but they ended up staying in the cabin for a week. And they had to get food dropped by troopers. State troopers, the Army, and the U.S. Coast Guard were all trying to help rescue them. And the military actually dropped food to them 3 times. So all's well that ends well, and it ended well for these guys because they were well prepared. They had the right clothes, they had sleeping bags, they had GPS, and they had the satellite phone. And they're very experienced. They'd made this trip lots of times, and it turns out a couple of them are even search and rescue volunteers.
That sounds like they were very lucky. Jocelyn, do you think that this could be related to climate change?
Well, in part. Meteorologists always say you can't attribute any single weather event to climate change. It's the whole changing spectrum of weather events. But it is, in a way, in the sense that this is the time of year when the Yukon River freezes up, but it usually takes a couple of weeks. And for it to go from open water to, filled with ice that quickly is really unusual. Rex Nick said he'd never seen anything like it. So the other thing is that the reason they were on this hunting trip is because they were hunting for seals and beluga. And the reason they were hunting for it is because they're trying to fill their freezers for the winter. So the Yukon River is huge. It's 1,200 miles long. And actually where they were, it's about 3,000 feet across. And so usually the Yukon and its tributaries, there are millions of salmon that come back to the Yukon and its tributaries to spawn. And that was the situation historically. And then even a couple of years ago, the numbers have been declining, but even a couple of years ago, there were hundreds of thousands of salmon in the river. And now the numbers have dropped to the point that all the harvesting, the fishing by, commercial, sports, and subsistence fishing was all shut down. So this is amazing.
And I'm curious, did they have any advice for others who may find themselves in a situation like this?
Yeah. So Rex Nick said, don't let this kind of story discourage you from getting out and enjoying the outdoors. He said he's waiting for winter because in winter you can use snow machines and the rivers freeze up and you can actually drive vehicles on rivers and use them practically as highways. So he's looking forward to winter.
Oh, yes, I could imagine. And Jacqueline, very quickly, we only have about a minute left with one another, but I'm curious, can you tell us what else you're working on?
Let's see. I'm working on a story about some honoring nations awards that were given to 6 different tribes. This is out of the Harvard School of Government Economic Development Project. And I mean, it's really inspiring to read. And well, they had an award ceremony, so I was able to watch that and listen to people describe their projects. And it's really inspiring to see what they have going. I mean, everything from microgrids to support their electrical system to curriculum. In Palm Springs, they're working with the Palm Springs district, and classes about tribes in the area are mandatory for several grades, and the curriculum was actually developed with the help of the tribe in their own words.
Well, Jacqueline Estes, we'll look forward to your reporting. Thank you so much for being here.
My pleasure. See you. Bye-bye.
And that's a slice of our Indigenous world. Thank you for watching. For all the latest news and updates, visit us anytime at IndianCountryToday.com. I'm Aaliyah Chavez.
Sometimes you got to take a stand just because you know you can. Oh, you got to run, you got to run. Standing
This is Indian Country Today.